Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Becky Robinson, and I'm here today with David Burkus to talk about an important topic from his new book, Management. Hi, David. How are you?
I'm good. How are you doing?
I am doing well also. It feels like summer. I don't know. For those of you who are
It's
calling in, we
been
would
summer
love to.
for months.
Well, I live in Michigan, David. It takes a while for it to heat
Uh,
up here. I think it finally
and it's
feels
only
like
really summer for
summer.
like a week up there. Yeah, that's true.
Exactly. So if you could take a moment to get familiar with the GoToWebinar panel, we would love to take your questions later during this event. So if you want to take a quick moment and familiarize yourself with the question panel and tell me where you are in the world and whether you're feeling summer or not. Looks like we have a caller from Ogden, Utah, where it's probably still morning, so forgive me to those of you who are in different time zones. Very summer in Boise, Idaho. Welcome, Andy. Looks like Texas, Canada, Colorado Springs, Toronto, another Canada caller, Phoenix, Arizona. I would not want to be in Phoenix where it's going to be 110 degrees today, David.
Wow.
Crazy. Wow, Albuquerque, New Mexico, Georgia, lots of different people in lots of different places, and we're so thrilled that you're choosing to invest an hour in learning with David and me. A couple of more things that you might want to know about this event. We will share today's slides with you in a PDF format after the event. We will also be recording this event, and we will share that video recording on our YouTube channel, on our website, and in an email to you. And if you're on the call until the end of the session, you'll also find out about a way you can get a copy of David's book for free. We'd love to have you join our conversation on social media. You can use the hashtag #undernewmanagement, and you can tweet David's handle, which is his name, first name, David Burkus, last name. If you forget, it's right on the screen, so you can tweet about what you're learning today. David, did I forget anything?
No, I mean I think that's really good. I am not seeing anybody's responses on this thing, so I think that
Oh,
means when we
I
come to
can make that
Q&A.
I can make that possible for you, David, but I'm also really thrilled to read the questions to you
Okay.
during the Q&A. But I will, there you go. You can now see it. I typically let you
Thank
just focus on your presentation, and I read all that stuff behind the scenes.
All right, cool. I just wanted to
So
make sure. So,
no problem. I want to take a moment to introduce David before I go off camera. David has been my friend nearly the entire time I've been working online, which is since about 2009. And David is, as you might know, a best-selling author and award-winning podcaster. And he's also a professor, an associate professor of management at Oral Roberts University. His latest book is the one we're focusing on today, Under New Management, and the book challenges the traditional and widely accepted principles of business management and proves that they're outdated and there might be better ways to go about doing business. We're going to focus on one of those areas today that could use to be changed. So David is also a dad of two sons, and he lives in Tulsa, Oklahoma. And I think, is there anything else that you would have wished I would have told everyone about, David?
no, that's pretty good. You and I both moved, although obviously to different houses and all that sort of stuff. It's one of the reasons we're actually coming to you from my office at the university today, which is I'm like breaking a cardinal rule. I'm showing up at the university during the summer, but that's because the office is not unpacked yet. So forgive me for that. We normally have a way cooler setup, but I didn't want to wait until, well, actually I didn't want to unpack. I'll be honest. I just didn't want to unpack. So,
I
so
feel your
that's
pain, David. I definitely do. Well, I'm going to go off camera and mute myself and let you share with us some amazing wisdom, and I'll be back on at the end um, so that we can take the questions that the folks who have joined us today might have. So
all
thanks.
right. All right. No, thank you. This sounds great. So, as Becky alluded to, the new book that's out is Under New Management, and I want to drill down into one of the ideas that we cover in Under New Management, obviously around performance appraisals. That's the one you signed up for. But first, to kind of set the stage, I want to give this. I got to put my management professor hat on, and talk about sort of the history of management thought and how we got to where we are today, and what's wrong with where we are today. So it's 2016, a little over 100 years ago. If you want to get like super specific, it was actually 1913. But around the turn of the century, there was this gentleman who influenced management thought, well, actually created the field of management thought. And essentially his idea was, at the time, it's turn of the century, There are bigger and bigger factories, more and more machines being created that are taking the work of individual artisans that take a whole day to make something and turning it into a mass-produced system. We're also experimenting with new energy sources to power all of those systems. It's a really exciting time to be in business in America, but there are some problems. And around this time, a gentleman by the name of Frederick Taylor, you might have heard of him, a gentleman by the name of Frederick Taylor approached a lot of these factories and said, I know how to make your factory far more efficient than you could imagine. What we need to do is we need to study every single step in the production process, and we need to assign each step. Well, at first, we need to eliminate any of the unnecessary ones that we find from our study, but then for the ones that are necessary, we need to assign one person to each step and train them on the perfect way to execute that activity, and then just have them keep executing that one activity over and over and over and over again. And this is where that assembly line model that we often attribute to Henry Ford, although it had been in existence, Ford was just one of the ones that really exploded it. And Taylor also believed that in order to do this right, you needed to create sort of two tiers of worker. You needed the factory line labor worker, and you needed management. This was really the beginning of the mass adoption of a management class inside organizations, because management knew the whole process, and management knew the best way to do these individual tasks. And Taylor believed that was outside of the cognitive capacity of most of these employees. And it's a kind of a weird way to look at humans, for sure, but it worked. It worked really, really well. And we saw a huge boost in the Industrial Revolution as a result of Taylor's ideas. And we also, because of Taylor's ideas, that made possible the shift from industrial work to knowledge work that most of us have gone through. In fact, I would probably argue that most of you attending here today are not also working on an assembly line right now, because if you are, I don't know how you got to a computer, got reclined, and were able to tune into this webinar. Even if you were, the factories that we work in today, the production lines that we run today, are very different and far more complicated than Frederick Taylor ever imagined, right? But there are a lot of management practices that we drug with us from the factory to the office. And some of them are breaking down, especially as we shifted. We shifted from industrial to knowledge work, and now we're really shifting from knowledge work to creative work. Most of us aren't making things anymore. We're coming up with ideas. We're not assembling products. We're solving problems. We're having to come up with ideas, solve problems, create innovative solutions, deal with customer issues, all sorts of different stuff that requires us to tap into our more creative side. And what we're finding is a lot of the assumptions around this management and labor divide, management knowing what to do and measuring what is done, and labor just doing it, turning their mind off and being an unskilled cog in the machine. This has led to a lot of different approaches breaking down. And one of them is that performance appraisal system. I just realized there's a typo in this slide. That's amazing. It's not appraisals, it's appraisals. But there you go. One of them is that performance appraisal system. There are a lot of companies that are throwing them in the trash can. Essentially, the most interesting one to me, and I'll tell you the story of it, of what they did and how they did it, but there are a lot of companies that are saying this system isn't working the way we wanted it to work. And here's why. The goals of performance appraisals are really, really noble. The goal, the idea to give people feedback, to give people a meaningful measurement of where their performance is and how it stands compared to other people, to use it for development decisions and leadership development and high potential decisions. All of those goals are very, very noble. But what people are finding is the system isn't producing those goals. Instead, you have this sort of annual rite of passage where people negotiate to get a label assigned to them. I mean, I would imagine, I want to ask you, you can put it in the questions window. I would imagine how many of you actually enjoy your performance appraisal process versus sort of play the game. Either write like love it or play the game in the chat window. Decide what do you do, or excuse me, the questions window. How do you treat this? Because I think most people, a lot of people, know that even if they value the feedback portion of it, there is a lot more game playing to be done in this system. And in order to get ahead, right, you've sort of got to play that game, which is when good, I love it. Amy, I love your response, right? So most people are writing up, we play the game, we refuse the game, I like that. And then when good, I love it. And this is the system. And this is the one we're in, and a lot of executives, a lot of leaders of bigger companies and leaders of startups are deciding this system is not the game that we wanted. This is not the way we wished we could actually increase performance. So I'll tell you a quick story about one company that did this very, very notably, Adobe. Adobe systems, they make, if you've ever read a PDF, including the PDF you're going to get of these slides, you've interacted with an Adobe product. Adobe used to operate like almost all software companies used to operate. I don't know if you remember this, but do you remember when you used to have to go to a store and buy a box to buy software? It seems weird in 2016 that you can't just download it off the cloud. But we used to have to, like when Windows 95 came out, there were people rushing CompUSA. Both of those things, 95 and CompUSA, don't exist anymore. But maybe CompUSA does. I don't know. I haven't been doing it in a while because I don't need to buy software in a box anymore. And that was what Adobe was doing. You would buy Acrobat, or you would buy their creative suite of products, any of their software products, you would buy on an annual basis. They would update them often, about once a year with bug fixes and that sort of thing. They would sell the new update, and that was the thing. You bought a year subscription to the product, you downloaded the software off a floppy drive, remember when those existed, or CD-ROM or what have you. And because of that, it was really easy to keep an annual cycle to all of their products. Well, obviously Adobe has shifted. Now almost all of their products are subscription-based. You pay month by month depending on what you want to do. Adobe Creative Cloud is their big flagship product. And it is now a piece-by-piece, month-by-month, ongoing system. This is that software service idea that we hear more often. And that led a lot of the leaders of Adobe to think about what else needs to be innovated. And then a really interesting sort of tidbit in history I just find fascinating. Then a really odd interview occurred that really blew up the performance appraisal system for Adobe. So what happened was Donna Morris, one of the heads of human resources, took an overnight flight to India to interact with the people in Adobe there. She did an interview with an Indian newspaper. And I don't know if it was a combination of jet lag, fatigue, whatever it was, but she was asked, what are you working on now to develop the people at Adobe? And she said, we're going to completely revamp and probably eliminate our performance appraisal system, our annual review system. And it did not take long for word to spread, right? The next day, it's front page news in that newspaper. Doesn't take very long for that to get back to the United States. And in order to sort of head that off, Donna Morris and the HR team basically had to cut it off at the pass and post on the company intranet, hey, here's what we're thinking. We want to revamp this thing. Let's open up a conversation about what's working, what's not working, and how we can improve it. And the gist of what the majority of employees said was, look, like as we just talked about, the goals are noble. There are people who love it. People especially love getting feedback, but the annual system is too much. We don't want to continue to play it. And so they looked around for a system that could replace it. And what they found was that they were going to take all of the hours training people on how to do an annual review, executing an annual review, then documenting an annual review, taking all of those hours, tens of thousands of hours across thousands of managers and tens of thousands of employees. And they were going to retrain managers on how to do a little bit different system, what they call check-ins. Check-ins is an informal system. So it replaces the annual review with an informal system that happens far more regularly. And a check-in is any conversation that is informal and could be as little as 10 minutes as long as 3 different things are discussed. 3 different things have to be discussed in order for it to be a check-in. They have to discuss expectations, feedback, and growth and development. Expectations, feedback, and growth and development. Now you'll notice what's absent from here. What's absent are all sorts of behavioral anchored rating scales, labels, stack ranking, all of that sort of stuff. We'll get into that in a little bit. But for now, I want to dive into Adobe system because I think even if you still have performance appraisals, I think David said he has 67 he needs to complete, right? Even if you have no authority to ditch performance appraisals as a whole, you do have the ability to implement check-ins if you understand them and make it so that annual review isn't a surprise. So again, a check-in is anything that encompasses these 3 areas: expectations, feedback, and growth and development. Let's dive a bit into each one. So expectations refers to setting, tracking, and reviewing clear objectives. Setting, tracking, and reviewing clear objectives. What this means is not only what are my expectations for as a manager, what are my expectations for you as an employee, what are the goals that we're going to set, what were the goals we set last session, how did we track them, did we pick the right way to measure them, did you meet them, did you not meet them, those sort of things. and coming up with those clear objectives, but also expectations for me as the manager. What are your expectations for me? What are the resources you need from me? It's a much more balanced system where we're having a more open and honest conversation about these expectations, setting, tracking, reviewing clear objectives. So that's expectations. The next one refers to feedback, giving and receiving ongoing feedback and coaching. This means, okay, we had these goals. Did you hit these goals? Did you not hit these goals? Right? And if you didn't hit the goals, why? What feedback do I need to give you to help you improve? What feedback do I need to give you to show you where you're doing well? This is where that coaching element comes into play. But again, this is a reciprocal system. This is a totally reciprocal system. So it's not only as the manager, what is my feedback for you on how you're doing? It's also that Ed Koch thing. How am I doing? Right? How am I giving you what you need? How am I doing? Where do I need to improve, et cetera? And then perhaps the most important piece, and I'll dive into this in a second, but in my opinion, perhaps the most important piece is making sure that every check-in, every single check-in, because there are a lot of informal conversations about expectations and giving feedback. That happens often, but every check-in also has to have growth and development. Every check-in also has to have an opportunity to talk about opportunities. Where do you want to go with this company? What developmental opportunities do I need to create for you? If you want to be a manager, maybe I need to bring you in the next time we hire someone so you can know what that process looks like. Maybe I need to actually give a bigger project over to you so you can experiment with lead, et cetera. Maybe, and this happens because this is an informal system, maybe we've come to the realization that your biggest opportunities lie elsewhere. And while the timing's not right for you to depart yet, you're actually going to be stepping into a different role, a different company, a different division inside of Adobe, whatever that is. And again, because check-ins are informal, a far more open and honest conversation about growth and development actually happens. So here's my next question for everybody. You can type it in the chat window, and I'll tell you I've done this when it comes to growth and development. How many of you have ever pretended that you're making a long commitment to a company during a performance review and you know you're leaving? You just know you're leaving. So you've just sort of just say yes or no, or I did, or if you want to tell me the whole story, I'd love to hear it. I'm going to dive into these when I get the chance because I think it's so fun to see. The same thing happened to me, right? So I knew at one point, no, oh, you people are all so honest that you haven't done that. So I'll tell you my story. I was before I became an academic, I was in the pharmaceutical industry. I knew I was leaving. I knew I was going back to grad school. I knew when I started that I was there for a certain period of time as my wife went through her schooling. And then when she was done with that, it was my turn to go back to school, et cetera. And I knew that I was leaving, starting grad school in August, starting teaching, et cetera, in August. And our annual reviews happened in June. Right, which meant that, here are the yeses, sorry. It took a while for the yeses and the people to admit, yeah, I've totally done that. The no's outweigh the yeses, so I'm still impressed that there's a more honest group. But so I had to do my review in June. And of course, because I didn't want to tell them I'm leaving in 2 months, right, because they probably would have cut me loose anyway. It's a very interesting industry that I worked in, which shaped this. We couldn't have an open and honest conversation about it because as soon as you showed exit intent, you were basically blocked out of the organization. I could go into a whole other monologue about why that's a bad idea, but that's not the monologue you've tuned in for today. The point was I had to go through this whole review pretending that I cared about expectations and feedback and growth and development in particular, pretending what all of these sort of goals were, when I knew that 2 months from now I was hitting the door. Interestingly enough, shortly after that happened, that situation with that boss happened, she got reassigned to a different division. The person who came in was actually a former teammate of mine, so a former peer who became a new manager. And because we had that rapport, I basically told him in early July, hey, I'm gone in August, and I don't want to announce this yet because I want to keep working, but you have the chance to do this. So again, though, that's an example. The informality, even in my personal life, the informality of the situation allowed me to have a more open and honest conversation than I would if I had to have a formal one. Excuse me a second. I'm gonna readjust one quick thing here, slide something around, and then I want to show you the results that Adobe had from doing this expectations, feedback, and growth and development. So here's what happened. So dramatic increases in morale once the system was rolled out. What was happening was, because it was an annual system, you could basically slack off for 11 months before they could really do anything about it. I mean, as long as you didn't break any overt rules, if they were going to fire you for a performance issue, it took a while to get it all documented. So they would see this spike in involuntary departures right after the review system, and then basically nobody would be fired for a long period of time. So there was an increase in involuntary departures, but this was actually a good thing, because this was getting rid of the people who were hiding their mediocrity, if you will, inside this annual system. Increases in productivity, increases in revenue. Overall, the system worked very, very well for Adobe, and it's worked well for a lot of the other companies that have decided to throw performance appraisals in the trash can and replace them with something a little more informal. And that's a big key. I want to point out that this isn't just about eliminating an annual rite of passage that people largely don't like. Because as we saw in our poll, there are people who need and want feedback. I'd argue that everybody needs that feedback and everybody needs that coaching. The challenge is that the goals of the performance appraisal system are not allowing that to happen. And that's a big issue. That's a big deal. I want to dive into two main reasons why the annual review, as we know it, is possibly not working as well as we thought. The first is that rank and yank that is associated with a lot of these systems, or you could call it stack ranking, you can call it evaluations on a curve, you can call it top grading, you can call it a bunch of different things, but essentially it looks like this. A lot of systems use a label, whether it's high performer, adequate, meets expectations, exceeds expectations, underperforms, etc. A lot of people will use a 3 to 4 label system to evaluate the overall performance of an employee. So it's not just I'm going to look at these 5 dimensions that we're evaluating performance on and help you and give you feedback on each of those 5. It's also, and here's the overall ranking. And there are just like the annual review as a whole, there are valid reasons why this was implemented. Right? Especially when you're thinking about a large organization where not everybody has an individual experience with everybody else, and we've got to make promotion decisions and that sort of thing. It can be really helpful to have a file like this going on. But there's a problem with it. There's actually really 2 problems with rank and yank. The first is, let's do a thought experiment, right? So most often when we see a top grading or a stack ranking system, it emulates the one that really was popularized by Jack Welch at GE, this idea that 20% of people get categorized as A players, 70%, the vast majority, get B players, and then the 10% are C players. And the C players usually have to improve or disappear, right? Or invited to be successful elsewhere. What often happens with this in practice is there's a lot of organizations see a lot of horse trading that goes around, right? So we know that 20% of the entire workforce needs to be A players. We don't know why they need to be that way. That's just what came down from management. And you'll see middle managers actually trading like, hey, I have this guy or girl, and she really needs to be an A player, but I'm out of spaces. Can you trade me this? I mean, it's honestly like running the NFL draft. It's not an adequate reflection. And the reason that's done is a response to the lunacy of, if you have a team of 10 people, how likely is it that every single team of 10 people only has 2 A players, 7 B players, and 1 C player, right? Performance is a little bit more fluid, a little bit harder to evaluate than that. The other thing you find is that this was the case at Microsoft, and why they did away with stack ranking, is you found that people, A players especially, actively avoided other previously rated A players, because if you're on a team with somebody and you're going to get evaluated as an A player in 1 year, you don't want to drop that by joining a team that already has 2 A players. One of you is going to get dismissed, get bumped down. The other sort of thing that goes on in this stack ranking system is we make this assumption that if we get rid of the C players, we can replace them with B and A players. And there's a lot of research about the portability of talent that suggests that this might not actually be true. I should add, even if we got rid of the C player for that year, we replace them with an A player, well, now we've got 30 and 70 and no 10. Or we got to force somebody down into that 10 rank. And while, yeah, eventually we might have a room full of A players, what we've effectively done is started relabeling A players as B players. And that can actually have a pretty interesting effect. The research for this effect, and interestingly negative, goes into the orientations that different people have about their development, their performance, et cetera. So So most people, you can categorize, this comes from the work of Carol Dweck. Most people have a learning goal orientation or a performance prove goal orientation, meaning when goals are set out, some people want to learn and some people want to prove that they're good. Carol Dweck actually simplified these in her popular press book, Mindset, into a growth mindset or a fixed mindset. But the idea is that some people go after goals and go after projects and performance tasks, seeking to learn and seeking to improve. And some people believe that talent is fixed, their ability to perform is fixed, and so their goal should be to prove that they are good enough, right? And it turns out that while learning goal-oriented people may be a little bit negatively affected by this change in labels, there's a dramatically negative effect. Performance prove goal orientation people, right? The people who are working to have a certain label. And then when that label changes, right, this can be a big issue. Especially, and this is, I think, really interesting, when you look at surveys of people who are satisfied with their performance evaluation system, and especially satisfied with their labeling system, you find that there's a disconnect between managers giving out a label and employees believing that that was the right one or the best one to describe them. So what I mean by this is, and you can tell me in the chat window, actually, if this has ever happened to you. So what happens often is a manager will say, oh, you're a meets performer. This is fantastic. You should continue to go on with that. Or, and the individual employee will basically say, well, I really felt like I exceeded performance. Has this ever happened to you? Have you ever sat down, gotten your performance appraisal, and the label that you were given, the rating on your performance was different and worse than the one that you thought it was? Just let me know. A simple yes or no is fine. If you want to go into a bigger story, that's fine too. But just let me know. I think it's interesting because the research, yes, absolutely, et cetera, yes, yes. You see what's going on here. Now, I would argue that most of the time, the manager actually believed that they were giving you a really good label, and you, of course, were disappointed. Imagine, so that's your situation. You might not know if you have a learning goal orientation or performance prove orientation. It turns out that it doesn't matter. Both situations are negatively affected by this. It's just that performance prove, the fixed mindset people are even more negatively affected by this. And it's not the fault of the manager. They might actually think that they're giving you a label that works really, really well, right? So this is the one of the big problems with the annual rite of pass system is the stack ranking system, the labeling system can have a devastating effect because people can be disappointed. It can have a dramatic effect long-term on how they think they're being treated and what they think their availability to even improve their performances. The other reason is perspective. So we think about the annual rite of passage, right? We think about this idea that, oh, Jay, thank you so much for sharing that story. So Jay says, by the way, before I dive into perspective, I just want to take the time to point this out. Jay says he worked under a system. It was largely driven by compensation and apparently random targets from central HR. It was based on a bell curve. Now, here's one thing I think is super interesting about basing stuff on a bell curve. A bell curve is meant to be a generalized system. You know, we all know the bell curve, the inverted U curve. It's meant to be a normative distribution for a general population, right? So if your company is big enough and the amount of roles are big enough to encompass a general population, there's no problem with the bell curve. But if your hiring system is any good, you should be winnowing out a lot of the people that are on the lower end of the bell curve. So your bell curve should actually look a lot more like a long tail than a bell curve, right? So this idea that we're basing stuff on a curve when in actuality our population, the organization, shouldn't be reflective, if our hiring is right, shouldn't be reflective of the general population. It should be just reflective of the best of the best. So Jay, thank you for sharing that. That pointed out a big assumption that I think is fundamentally flawed with basing stuff on the bell curve. And for what it's worth, I go into this rant every semester with my students about why I don't grade on a curve, but that's beside the point. So the other reason is we're talking about perspective. So when you're giving someone an annual review, right, you're only checking in once a year. Year one, year two, you're checking in and saying, how'd we do for the past year? I liken this to, imagine if you were playing football. Actually, it doesn't matter, American rules football or European rules football, or world rules football, I should say. Imagine you're playing football and you go out and you play that game and you have to wait a week or even worse, a year to know what the score of the game was. How do you make adjustments for the next week? How do you prepare for the next week? If this is true. If you're not getting feedback often enough, you're not doing the things you need to do to make course corrections, to make adjustments, to fix it. So even if we say that the labeling system is good because it gives us the ability to make HR decisions, which may or may not be true. Personally, I think the stack ranking system does more damage than it does good, as we can see from a lot of your responses on the labeling thing. We have to come to terms with the idea that this cannot be an annual thing. We cannot just give people feedback on an annual basis. Even if we still have to do an annual review system, we should probably be doing something like check-ins so that we can have maybe quarterly reviews, or maybe those one-on-one informal discussions, so that when we get to the end of the year, even if we have to fill out that form, no one is surprised, and it's just another conversation in this history of conversations that we've had. And that's what I love the most about Adobe's check-in system and the systems that are similar to it. And I'm picking on Adobe because I think they do a really good job segmenting out these three things. All of the other companies that have disappeared with their performance appraisal that you read about in the media, et cetera, essentially do replace them with informal discussions. And usually they're based on those three things, or two of those three things, four, et cetera. But I think that idea, because I think 3 is the sort of magic number you can get your head around. Basing those one-on-one informal conversations on those, right? To give you just a quick review. So those are expectations, feedback, and growth and development. Expectations, feedback, growth, and development. This system, even just having these one-on-one informal conversations inside the larger system of having to do the annual review because you can't scrap it in your own organization, dramatic increases on your team. You're going to get a pocket of excellence inside your organization. So expectations, remember, this is setting, tracking, reviewing clear objectives. Feedback, this is giving and receiving ongoing feedback and coaching. And then growth and development, this is the opportunity to talk about opportunities. What are the opportunities you have out there for you? What are the opportunities that I need to create for you as a manager so that you can develop? Having that open, honest conversation about where you want to go and how that lines up with where we want to go. And even if it doesn't line up, having an open and honest conversation about how we can do what's in both parties' best interests. So we've covered a lot of material in the past few minutes. We've covered a lot of different stories of what companies are doing, the science behind why they're not working. We've covered a lot of different stuff. And I imagine most of you, especially based on your responses to that last question, I imagine most of you are thinking like, yes, this is pretty good. We should make this switch, but how do I talk other people into it? Or you're thinking like, man, this all sounds good, but it's a lot of work. And I don't really know if that work is going to be worth it. In either case, actually, whether you're like getting ready to lead the charge on revamping your performance appraisal system, or whether you don't necessarily even want to charge forward on it, want to keep it where it is, it comes down to the same thing. Why should we bother to change? Because change is a lot of work, and what we're doing now is working. And I want to give you an analogy that I found particularly helpful. I'll be honest with you, I'm a bit of a nerd. And I once tried to read a physics textbook. I didn't take a physics class in college. I once tried to read a physics textbook just to get sort of caught up. And the only thing I remember was this little piece of information I heard about the internal combustion engine, the one that powers, all of our automobiles, unless you have a Tesla or a Leaf or a similar electric car. That internal combustion engine, the one that Henry Ford was creating in the assembly line, Frederick Taylor helped invent, right? That, the internal combustion engine. Here's what I remember reading from it. The internal combustion engine is only 30% efficient. 30% efficient. Now, here's what I mean by that. That's not fuel efficiency, miles per gallon, that sort of thing. Those are actually kind of made up statistics to deal with this problem. What I mean is that 30% of the energy that's stored in a gallon of gasoline, that's stored in the gasoline tank of the engine, 30% of that energy, the potential energy that's there, gets transferred into forward motion. The rest, when the system starts going through, the rest is lost to heat and friction and all sorts of other things that honestly I didn't really understand. But I remember this 30% number because 30% of the energy is getting captured and turned into forward motion. And if you think about it, organizations are a lot like engines, right? Or especially knowledge work and creative work organizations, they're charged with taking energy and transforming it into productivity, transforming it into value for customers, transforming it into profitability for the organization. Whatever the goal is, an organization has to capture energy and turn it into value. And, you know, in Frederick Taylor's days, that was physical brute force. But in our days, the fuel running most organizations isn't brute labor, it's mental energy. It's mental energy. So what do we do to judge the efficiency of mental energy? It turns out there's a number for this. You probably already know where I'm headed with this because it's been a number we've been tracking for about 20 years. What is tracking mental energy? It's employee engagement. Employee engagement, studied by the Gallup organization, has been 18% for a couple of decades. What this means that basically 2 out of 10 people say they can bring their whole energy to work. 2 out of 10 people say they can do their best work, bring their whole focus, be their whole selves at work. 2 out of 10. So just like the internal combustion engine works, if you're willing to accept that 30% of the energy gets translated in forward motion, yeah, your organization works. What you're doing now works. And your engagement scores might be higher than 18%, but I bet you they're not 100%. I bet you they're probably not even 50%. I'll be honest. These systems work, but only if you're willing to settle for that number. And that's a problem, right? I'm not willing to accept 18%. The fuel running most organizations is mental energy, and we're not capturing enough of it and turning it into value. And ditching performance appraisals is just one way that we're not doing that. And I believe this speaks to our goal as leaders. I was interviewing one leader, Dane Atkinson, he's the CEO of Somol, and he said it this way: great leaders don't innovate the product, they innovate the factory. They don't innovate the product, they innovate the factory. Meaning, in order to get innovative products and services and value for the organization, great leaders turn their focus to their people and figure out what innovations they need to make in order to capture more of the energy of their people. Frederick Taylor did it then. Dane Atkinson, Donna Morris, the leaders of Microsoft, all of the people we've been talking about today on this webinar, they all did it as well. They innovated the factory in order to capture their best people's work. And that is what we're about. Performance appraisals are just one way we can look for factory innovations that will help us get more out of our people, raise that engagement number, and create more value. With that, Becky, I want to transition into questions. Are you there? Are you back?
I'm coming. Here I am. I am back.
Perfect. Hey, no worries. I'm actually doing this ironically as sort of lights are flickering. I think we've got a storm going on outside. It's kind of funny. So I know. I just wanted to say that in case like something crazy happens and suddenly I drop off. It's because of that, not because of I'm here. Okay. I'm not. Yeah.
That was crazy. So we're willing and ready and able to take your questions or comments at this time, and you can put those in the question panel and we'll address those. I like this comment from David. Employees are way past being graded. They want to be talked to, appreciated, and challenged to be better.
Totally. I totally agree. And, you know, the goal of this was to give them that feedback, give them that challenge, give them that appreciation. But when there's that disconnect between labels and one party thinking the label is good and the other thinking it's bad, that can create these sort of challenges. So, that creates that system. Hey, while we actually have you and while we're waiting, we've got a couple questions, mostly people telling me I'm frozen. Sorry about that. Not frozen in a good way, like singing Let It Go or anything like that. I also wanted to tell you that this is actually really cool if you're attending this or you're watching the replay still in the month of July. Amazon's actually discounted the ebook of my book. I want to put a URL up there. If you go to davidburkus.com/sale, you can actually read about this chapter, about Donna Morris and Adobe and all of that sort of stuff for literally $3. The ebook copy is just $3. So I'll leave that up as we do Q&A. I highly encourage you to check that out. So how are we going question-wise?
Yeah, I mean, I can share the questions with you, and I know you're looking at them also. So if there's one that jumps out at you, feel free. John is wondering, David.
I would turn it over to you to ask. So yeah, let's go with that.
Okay, all right. So John is wondering what the transition time for a successful implementation of ditching performance appraisals is. So how long does it take to turn the ship around, assuming there's proper buy-in?
Yeah, so assuming there's proper buy-in, which is good, that's the first big hurdle, to explain what the new system was going to be. So while you're doing that last annual review system, you're also explaining the check-in system. But before you do that, because remember, it's not like, hey, we're doing this year and next year we're doing this is the last time we're going to do this, and then we're immediately going to jump to this other informal system. So your managers have to be trained before that happens. So, I mean, total rollout, I'll be honest, you're looking at a year, probably because you want to start the new process at the end of the old formal process, which means you have to get everybody through training. All the managers who have to do these more informal coaching sessions, you want to get them through training before you do that last annual review so that you can start the ground running.
Got it. So this is an interesting question. When we talk about informal reviews, David, do you also recommend that there be an informal location? So for example, instead of formal in the office behind the desk, maybe at the coffee shop or ice cream restaurant. And also, do you recommend it being at an informal time, or is it just the process that needs to be informal?
So behavior is a function of personality and environment. Obviously, any environment has that influence. That being said, I don't think that's as important a variable. I really think the more important thing is that it's done with a spirit of informality. I don't think you need to go off campus or off whatever your office location is. I do think you should think about doing it in a more neutral location. So it's not come to my office and we'll do this review. You might, as the manager, you might actively go to each individual's office if they've got that. If you've got an open office, it's a little bit harder. But a neutral location like a conference room or something like that, where you can sit side by side in this, not across a big desk and a slightly higher chair and all that sort of stuff we're used to. Ideally, if you wanted to take everybody out to one a day and take everybody out for lunch or something like that, that'd be great. That adds a layer of cost to it. And again, our goal is a shorter conversation, 10, 20 minutes, maybe 30 minutes tops. So these things can happen quickly. But I do think it's best to happen in a neutral location, whether that's on company property or not. That's a different issue that I don't think is as important as being neutral.
Sure. So, David, what about a company that doesn't have a performance appraisal system yet? So Amy notes that her company's a startup and has nothing yet. So what could she do to begin to implement any type of performance system? And she's wondering, is that in the book?
So yes, in a sense, you should obviously you should check out the book in triplicate for your whole startup. No, I'm totally kidding. Actually, I think you're in a unique situation where you could implement something like check-ins more easily because there isn't that system. I bet a lot of times, especially in startups, the focus is do the work, do the work, do the work, do the work. We don't take enough time anyway. And a lot of times when we don't have any system, the formal review system comes as the solution to almost force you to give that feedback. The problem is it sets that minimum expectation and people only really give that minimum expectation. So I think in a startup with no formal system whatsoever, you're probably in a better position to start training and talking about check-in systems. I would definitely check out Under New Management for that. In Under New Management, in one of the footnotes, and you could probably find this by Googling around, I also link to a pretty thick, about a 20-page Stanford Graduate School of Business case study specifically on Adobe. So you could dive even deeper into check-ins if you wanted to do that. There's a lot of around check-ins. It's my favorite informal system. There are a lot of informal systems, but it's my favorite. And you can find that it's a free, that's a free download, the Stanford one. So you can check that out and also check out Under New Management.
So David has a really good comment here that check-ins should be scheduled and remain consistent because you don't want people to begin to think that you just aren't doing them. So you don't want them saying, hey, are we still doing that as it relates to check-ins, which is a really good point. Mary has a question.
You might want to have check-in day or check-in afternoon, every Friday in the afternoon, that's what we do, or every Monday afternoon or whatever. That I think works really, really well to let people know that it happens. Usually you're probably going to do them on a monthly basis. So you might just have like check-in day, the 15th of every month or whatever is check-in day. But again, I think that's good so that people know even when they're leaving that meeting. If you don't want to schedule a formal day, best thing to do is actually the last thing from check-in 1 is to schedule check-in 2 so that we know it's on the calendar. Great observation.
So, and Mary's wondering if you change from an annual review to informal check-ins, when do you evaluate salary?
So I'm honestly not the biggest fan of having performance and pay discussions together. I think you still have to have that salary discussion. I found that the organizations that switched to the informal have that as a different conversation at a different time, and usually the result of looking back over a couple different check-ins and what's been talked about and that sort of thing. But honestly, the research and even some company experience is on tying annual raises. I'm assuming you're talking about annual raises, not merit bonuses and that kind of a thing. But tying annual raises into that annual conversation, to be honest with you, it degrades the value of the conversation, because as soon as you start to talk about labels and money, everybody's focused on that. They're not taking the feedback anymore. They're figuring out how to convince their way into it. Or as soon as you tell them what percentage raise it is, they're trying to figure out if that's enough and all of these other sort of things. So I definitely think we start with splitting those two different things. You can still have that formal conversation on whatever fiscal year budgetary thing that your company does. And what you would do is essentially reflect back on the past check-ins, reflect back especially on the expectations and feedback side, and have that conversation. I would just have it at a different time. As I said, there's a lot of research that supports the idea that putting those two conversations together kind of devalues the impact of both of those conversations.
Sure. And David, you referenced, reflecting back on those check-ins. And John is wondering regarding the informality of the check-ins, what way you might recommend documenting those check-ins.
Yeah. So in terms of when you say documentation, I think about two different things. I think about the manager's notes on the check-in, and then I think about what goes in the HR employee file. Check-ins are not necessarily documented in the HR file, to live in their permanent record forever. Hey, are we there? Are we back? I'm sorry. We had another little flicker.
Yes, you're back.
My apologies. Thankfully, if you're listening to the replay, you'll catch none of this. How much of my answer did you catch?
Very little. Why don't you start over?
Okay. So essentially, in terms of documentation, we can be talking about managerial documentation or HR. A lot of times there will be notes taken from the manager. Those are usually kept to herself, et cetera. What goes in the permanent file in HR is very, very minimal. Basically, only those things that would be legally required to go into that file. Some companies then also make sure they want to document when it happened, and they're happy just to document that, but they're holding managers accountable to doing these frequently enough. And then what's in the manager's notes, that's usually done kind of on a case-by-case, company-by-company, manager-by-manager basis. But if the entirety of the conversation is knowingly being handed into a permanent record, people aren't going to be as honest as they are when they believe that not everything is being taken down. So in terms of documentation at the manager level, that varies. At the HR level, it's usually kept to a minimum so that we can have that conversation.
Got it. Okay. So I'm going to wade through all these, yes, David's frozen comments to get to some other questions. Cynthia mentions that time is a major excuse for managers not talking with employees. So how do you make them accountable or make sure that spending time in these informal check-ins becomes a priority?
Yeah. So again, the beauty of this system is it's actually not one to do a lot of prep for, like you would have to do in the case of the annual review system. You usually have to spend several hours prepping for it, then executing it, then documenting it, et cetera. So it takes a little bit less prep work. At the same time, you're right. How do you carve that time out? This is a challenge, and that's one of the reasons I think it's on HR to sort of document how often they're happening, because you do need to have accountability that they are happening. But we're talking about a much smaller commitment of time. We're talking about 10 minutes, 15 minutes, 20 minutes, 30 at the max. So it's easier to find the time to carve it into that. But you're right. Depending on the organization, depending on the culture, you might need some type of documentation that the check-in is happening so that you're holding people accountable. And everybody on the call, hey, I'm sorry about all of the freezing, et cetera. Here, I don't know if you can see on my camera, this is what's going on outside of us today, and we're staying committed to you on that. But if I break on that, sorry about that. I'm in a place where I'm safe for sure. I just can't control the electricity in the building. So again, I'm sorry about that. But we got a lot of red on my radar map on my phone. So that's what's going on.
Well, I don't know if you're anything like us. We need rain desperately. The grass at my house is dead and brown. So hopefully you'll stay safe. But rain is probably much needed.
We have too much of it down here. Texas, Arkansas, Oklahoma, all of the rain that normally goes in California, I think, has come here this season. It's been a little crazy.
Yikes. So David, do you want to touch this question asking how your current employer handles the performance review system? I'm not sure if you want to touch that one.
Yeah, so I don't want to touch that one, actually. No, I mean, I have to say universities are interesting because universities have sort of two types of staff, and faculty have totally different contracts, totally different review systems than do staff. The faculty one is a little bit more like what I'm talking about, a little bit more informal. the 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 staff one, I don't honestly know enough about because I'm not staff. I know that there is an annual system, and that creates a problem. I know that check-ins don't happen, but a prophet is not without honor in his hometown. So a lot of it comes from maybe they're just not paying attention to me.
Oh my.
Yeah.
So back to this question of documentation, are there any legal challenges associated with, perhaps there are performance challenges that aren't formally documented through this check-in process? And so how do you handle that from an HR legal perspective?
Right. And I have to say, I'm not a labor attorney, so this does not constitute legal advice. I have found that when there is a formal system, annual review, quarterly review, et cetera, honestly, we wait too long to fire people because we worry about documentation, right? And when it comes to progressive discipline, what we mean when we say documentation is, especially if you're in an at-will state, right? You can fire somebody for whatever. You just want to make sure that there's enough documentation should a wrongful firing accusation come back. Well, that documentation doesn't have to be an annual review system. It's anything that's in that kind of permanent record. So that can be email, that can be if there's glaring performance problems, bringing someone in from HR, those type of things. So often, when we go to this informal system, you see people get a little bit more creative and actually better at documentation because they're thinking about all of the ways outside of the annual review that they can document things. In organizations that do just basically do the annual review and that's it, what I see often is, as is the case with Adobe and the increase in involuntary departures, often we wait way too long to fire somebody because we're trying to show years of incompetence when showing 6 months of actively working against the organization and having that documented in a couple of different formats is usually more than enough. So again, it's a documentation is definitely important. I should also say on the note of not just how you document it, but inside these check-in conversations, I was saying this, I don't know if I got caught off when I was saying this to John's answer or not. There will be things that happen in this informal conversation that for legal reasons have to be documented. And that's one of the reasons why the training program leading up to it takes so long. You as a company, as HR, you've got to decide in your state, in your country, et cetera, what from an informal conversation might have to be legally documented if it comes up, et cetera. I can't give specific advice on that one because it varies so much by state, country, and all of that, and even regulatory bodies and industries. But that's part of why it takes a little bit of time to ramp up to this system because you've got to solve all of those things and train for them.
Sure, that's helpful. So someone is asking David for us to restate. David is a professor, associate professor at Oral Roberts University. He's located in Tulsa, Oklahoma. And even though we've known each other for 7 years, we have not yet met face to face unless this counts.
Yeah, that's true.
So there's a whole lot of comments here about the importance of feedback. And I find the whole thing to be exceedingly fascinating as also someone who's working in a startup. David made this comment, David who's commenting on the question panel, not you, David, that, most people, if you give them the choice between a high five and money, say they'll take the high five. Do you really find that to be true in your experience and research, David, that people care more about recognition and praise than they do about money?
Well, I suppose it depends on the amount of money and the amount of praise. Interestingly enough, there is research that supports the idea. One of my favorite studies is on salespeople. And there are instances where salespeople will literally shift the timing of orders that they're getting to give favorability to recognition and awards and award trips and those sort of things, even if it means getting a slightly lower bonus. So there's definitely a lot of recognition or a lot of evidence in the power of recognition. I will say that one of the most potent and free motivators is progress. Teresa Mobile has an amazing amount of research on this idea that people knowing that their work is making a difference and that they're making progress in their work is often a better motivator than end of the year bonuses or quarterly bonuses or that sort of thing. Again, obviously depends on the size of those bonuses, but better than what most of those are offered. And progress is free, but it comes from having these conversations where you can show that people are making progress, you're giving them feedback that they're developing themselves, et cetera. And I shouldn't say it's free, it does cost the time. But often 10 minutes every month to give that feedback is a lot cheaper than the quarterly bonuses that we're building into our systems to make up for a lack of feedback.
Got it. That's really helpful and useful. And if you're interested in that, perhaps we could share a link to that study in our follow-up email or um, help people find that
Yeah.
information.
Yeah, totally, Becky. I'll work with you to pull that, and also a link to the Stanford case study on Adobe, so they can dive into that as well. We'll put both of those in the follow-up email.
Okay, super. Well, David, thank you so much for investing an hour of your time with us despite the crazy weather outside, and
Hey, I'm
we all
so
hung in
sorry.
there together. For those of you who are still hanging in here with us, I do have a few copies of Under New Management in my office, and if you're interested in getting a copy, you can email me, Becky@weavinginfluence.com. We're interested in hearing your feedback. Feedback is so valuable. We're interested in hearing yours, so if you could send some feedback about this event to me, we'll randomly choose and get some books in the mail. And also a reminder that Under New Management is only $2.99 on Kindle right now, right, David?
Yes,
And
I should say that's inside the United States. There's a little bit weirdness going on. I can't predict what countries are. If you're having a problem with that, if you're in like London, I know we've got some attendees that are in the UK. Just email me. We'll figure it out.
okay, super. So definitely go to Amazon, check out Under New Management on Kindle for only $2.99. And we look forward to seeing you on some of our future events. And David, thank you again for this amazing hour together.
Oh, thank you so much for having me. Thank you to the attendees for all the great questions. This was so much fun.
Take care.